Beneath the moonless sky of Blackwood Forest, a single tree stood apart from the others, its gnarled branches reaching like claws, its roots twisting through the earth like veins of some ancient beast. Locals called it the Whispering Tree, a name spoken only in hushed tones, as though the mere mention might summon its wrath. No one dared venture near it, not after the stories, the disappearances, the voices in the wind, the shadows that moved when no one was there. But Emma didn't believe in stories. And tonight, as the wind howled through the forest, she would learn the truth, that some legends don't die. They hunger. In the heart of Blackwood Forest, an ancient tree stood, gnarled, skeletal, and twisted. The locals called it the Whispering Tree. No one knew its true name or origin, but legends swirled like mist around it. They said the tree had been there longer than memory, a sinister relic of a forgotten time. The villagers whispered about it in hushed tones, cautioning children not to wander too close. They claimed the tree fed on fear, on secrets, on sins. Strange happenings surrounded it, people disappearing, whispers in the wind carrying voices of the lost, and shadows moving where no one walked. For decades, curiosity had been the tree's greatest weapon, and tonight, it claimed a new victim. Emma, a nature photographer, had heard the stories but dismissed them as rural superstition. She came to Blackwood seeking inspiration, drawn by the haunting beauty of the forest. With her camera slung over her shoulder, she ventured deep into the woods, her boots crunching the frostbitten leaves beneath her feet. The air grew colder, heavier. Shadows stretched unnaturally long. A sense of foreboding prickled at her neck, but Emma pressed on, determined to find the legendary tree. Her guide, a scruffy local man named Peter, had refused to go beyond the forest's edge. "You'll regret it," he'd muttered, spitting on the ground. "We all do." By the time Emma found the tree, twilight had surrendered to night. It loomed before her, more grotesque than she'd imagined. The bark was gray and cracked, resembling weathered flesh. Its branches clawed the sky like skeletal fingers, and its roots erupted from the earth like coiled serpents. But it wasn't just the appearance, it was the feeling. The tree radiated malice, a palpable hatred that hung in the air. She raised her camera, but the moment her finger hovered over the shutter, the whispers began. At first they were faint, a soft murmuring that seemed to drift on the breeze. But as Emma stepped closer, they grew louder, clearer. Voices, fragmented and urgent, called her name. "Emma. Emma." She froze, her breath misting in the frigid air. The whispers seemed to come from the tree itself, resonating from deep within its gnarled trunk. The camera in her hands felt suddenly heavy, as if the tree's presence drained her strength. "Emma, help us." Her rational mind warred with primal fear. She forced a laugh, shaky and hollow. "It's just the wind," she whispered, trying to convince herself. But the voices didn't stop. They grew more insistent, overlapping, a cacophony of pleading and anguish. Then she saw it. Faces. Pale, ghastly faces pressed against the bark, their mouths open in silent screams. They were fleeting, vanishing the moment she blinked, but their terror was etched into her mind. "Peter was right," Emma muttered. She turned to leave, but the ground beneath her shifted. The roots seemed to writhe, coiling around her ankles like serpents. Panic surged. She tugged her legs free, stumbling back. Her flashlight flickered, its beam casting eerie shadows that danced across the forest floor. Then from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A figure, no, several figures, emerged from the darkness. They were translucent, spectral, their faces twisted with torment. One of them, a young woman in a tattered dress, reached out to Emma with trembling hands. "Help us," the ghostly figure whispered. "The tree keeps us here. It feeds on us. On you." Emma's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" she stammered, though her instincts screamed at her to run. "The whispers," the woman said. "They draw you in. And once you're close, it takes you. It plants you here, and you become part of it." Emma stumbled back, clutching her camera, as if it could protect her. The woman's face dissolved into ash, scattering in the wind. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. And then the tree moved. Its branches creaked, bending unnaturally. The bark split open, revealing a gaping maw lined with jagged thorn-like teeth. The air grew thick with the stench of decay. Emma screamed and bolted, dodging the grasping roots. The forest twisted around her, disorienting her. Every path looked the same, every shadow seemed alive. Her flashlight failed entirely, plunging her into darkness. But she could still hear the tree's whispers, now mingled with its monstrous laughter. She tripped and fell, the camera slipping from her grasp. As she scrambled to her feet, she felt the roots again, wrapping around her arms and legs, dragging her back toward the tree. She clawed at the ground, screaming, but the whispers drowned her out. "Stay with us," they said. "Forever." The last thing Emma saw before she was pulled into the tree was the faces, dozens of them, twisted with agony, emerging from its bark to welcome her. The next morning, Peter stood at the edge of the forest, gazing at the fog that clung to the trees like a shroud. He sighed, muttering a prayer under his breath. He knew Emma wouldn't return. No one ever did. Far away, in the heart of the forest, the whispering tree stood silent once more, its branches heavy with new whispers waiting to be heard. And so, the whispering tree stood silent once more, its branches swaying gently in the cold wind, as if in satisfaction. The forest swallowed the last echoes of Emma's struggle, leaving only the whispers to linger. Soft, insidious, promising secrets to those who dared to listen. Far away, at the forest's edge, the sun began to rise, casting pale light on a world that would never know what happened beneath its ancient canopy. But deep in the heart of Blackwood, the tree waited, hungry, patient, knowing someone would come again. They always did. Beware the whispering tree, for it is patient, and its hunger is eternal. It calls not to the curious, but to the vulnerable, the guilty, the broken. Its voice will creep into your dreams, weaving promises and lies, until you find yourself drawn back to its shadow. You might tell yourself it's just a story, just the wind in the trees, but deep down, you'll know the truth. The whispering tree never forgets. Its roots reach far, its whispers travel wide, and its branches cradle the souls it claims. Run while you can, but know this: once it has spoken your name, the forest will always find you. And when it does, the tree will be waiting, hungry, patient, and ready to make you part of its legend forever. The house doesn't exist on any map. It isn't listed in town records, and no one can recall when it was built. But everyone in the nearby village knows the stories. Those who step inside never leave the same. Some never leave at all. They say on quiet nights, you can hear the whispers of those trapped inside, begging for a salvation that will never come. It wasn't the kind of place Clara and Noah wanted to find, but the house wanted to find them. It began on a quiet evening, when Clara and her brother Noah decided to take a detour through the woods on their way home. The road was narrow, the trees arched overhead, forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. As they drove, the engine sputtered and died, leaving them stranded near a decaying wooden house that seemed to watch them with shadowed, empty windows. Clara, clutching her flashlight, persuaded Noah to seek help at the house. The air grew colder as they approached, and the wooden steps creaked loudly under their weight. Inside, the house smelled of rot and dust, and the walls were covered with peeling wallpaper revealing claw-like patterns. A faint hum seemed to resonate through the floorboards. As they explored, a low, guttural noise echoed through the house, freezing them in their tracks. It came from the basement. Despite Noah's protests, Clara insisted they investigate. The basement door was ajar, revealing stairs descending into an abyss of darkness. The hum grew louder, almost like whispering voices calling their names. At the bottom, they found a room filled with mirrors of all shapes and sizes. Each mirror reflected not their own images, but twisted versions of themselves, Clara with hollow eyes, Noah with an impossibly wide grin. One mirror showed a shadowed figure standing behind them, but when they turned, nothing was there. In the far corner of the basement was a heavy iron door, covered in rust and ancient symbols. The whispers became deafening as Clara reached for the handle. Noah tried to pull her back, but she was compelled to open it. Behind the door was a corridor that defied logic. It twisted and turned, growing narrower with each step, as if the walls were closing in. At the end of the corridor, they entered a cavernous room, unlike anything they'd ever seen. The walls dripped with black tar-like substance. In the center was an altar, and on it sat a book bound in flesh, pulsating like it had a heartbeat. As Clara approached, a shadowed entity emerged from the walls, tall, faceless, and wreathed in smoke. It spoke without words, filling their minds with unbearable screams. The entity revealed that the house was a trap, feeding on the souls of those who wandered too close. Clara and Noah were next. The book opened itself, pages flipping violently as grotesque images and symbols glowed. Desperate, they ran, the walls twisting and the floor crumbling beneath them. They burst out of the house just as it began to collapse in on itself. The forest was silent again, the oppressive canopy above gone. Their car started without issue, as though nothing had happened. But as they drove away, Clara noticed the rearview mirror. The shadowed entity was sitting in the back seat. Days later, Clara woke in her bed to find dirt under her fingernails and the faint sound of whispers coming from her closet. Noah was never seen again. Clara tried to convince herself it was all a nightmare, but the evidence was undeniable. Every night, the whispers returned, louder and closer. One evening, as she checked her closet, she found something horrifying. A single rusty nail embedded in the wood, oozing black tar. Beside it was a piece of paper, aged and torn, with scrawled writing that read, "He's watching. Always." Clara began to see things out of the corner of her eye. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Figures lurking just outside the edges of her vision. One night, while brushing her teeth, her bathroom mirror began to fog unnaturally. A single word appeared, written from the inside of the mirror: "Run." Driven to the brink of insanity, Clara decided to investigate her home for clues. She climbed into the attic, a place she had avoided since moving in. Among the dusty boxes and cobwebs, she found something horrifying. A small wooden doll, carved crudely, with a twisted face that bore a striking resemblance to Noah. Its body was nailed to a piece of old wood, and its eyes seemed to follow her. Beneath it lay the same flesh-bound book from the house, now covered in dust, but pulsating faintly as though it was alive. Convinced that the only way to end this nightmare was to confront the source, Clara drove back to the house in the woods. The structure now looked even more decayed, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. She noticed symbols carved into the trees leading up to the house, each glowing faintly with an eerie green light. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, and the whispers became screams. The house seemed alive, reshaping itself as Clara moved through it. Hallways twisted, rooms appeared where there were none before. At the heart of the house, she found the shadowed entity waiting for her. Its form was more distinct now, tall and skeletal, with glowing cracks running through its body, revealing a seething darkness within. It raised one clawed hand, and Clara was paralyzed. "You brought him here," it whispered. "Now you'll stay in his place." The entity revealed that Noah had made a deal to save Clara that night at the house. In exchange for her freedom, he had offered his soul, but now, the entity had grown hungry again and demanded another soul. It offered her a choice: bring someone else to the house or stay forever. Clara tried to resist, but the entity placed its clawed hand over her chest, and she felt her heartbeat slowing, her vision dimming. "You will choose," it hissed. Desperate and terrified, Clara agreed to bring another soul to the house. She returned to the woods and planted a handwritten sign near the road. "Car trouble? Knock for help." She felt the entity watching her from the treetops, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Days passed before she saw headlights approaching. A young couple, laughing and unaware, stopped to read the sign. Clara stepped into the shadows and whispered, "Forgive me." Clara fled as the couple entered the house, their laughter turning to screams moments later. She tried to live a normal life, but it was impossible. She woke every night at 3:33 a.m., her hands covered in blood she couldn't explain, and the whispers louder than ever. One night, she saw Noah's face in the mirror, his eyes hollow and his mouth open in a silent scream. "You didn't save me," he mouthed. Clara realized too late that the entity had tricked her. She was not free, it had only bound her closer. Every few nights she found herself back at the woods, luring another victim. The house consumed her mind, and she became its servant. One evening, a stranger knocked on her door. It was Noah. But he wasn't human anymore. His face was stretched, his eyes black as coal, and he smiled with jagged teeth. "Your turn, Clara," he whispered. The story ends with Clara's scream fading into the night as the house in the woods waits patiently for its next visitor. The house remains at the edge of the woods, its doors open, waiting. The whispers never stop, luring the curious, the desperate, and the lost.